Actually, we are at a very, very critical moment at this point in time. Many of us are looking towards Cancun. Now, the problem that some of us felt was when we were in Bali, sounds like it was so far away. The world thought that the United States would finally come on board in terms of doing something, because this was when Bush was just about to get out and Obama was supposed to come in, but it hadn't happened yet, but we knew that there was a direction. And so if you recall, what happened in Bali was that the United States was not a member of the Kyoto Protocol. There was a Bali understanding that the US will do comparable targets in mitigation, that it will do what the developed countries in the Kyoto Protocol would do at a comparable level. From Bali to now, if you really look back, what you have seen is really that the world was hoping for US engagement in a positive, constructive way. However, what we saw happen in Copenhagen was a disaster. For those of you who do not know how the Copenhagen Accord was hatched, and this is very important for you to know, because it was quite clear in Copenhagen that the pressure was really, if the United States was to do a deal, you have to get China on board. And this is where the problem really begins, because if you look at the historical responsibility of United States, it's really the world's biggest historical polluter. And yet it does not own up to its historical responsibility, and it keeps talking about China as the major emitter, and that it will not do anything if China doesn't come on board. So you had an accord which was basically Mr. Obama flew in from Nobel Prize, landing in Copenhagen, and then hatching this agreement, which was only within 26 heads of states. When you had President Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, all of them there, my own Prime Minister from Malaysia, who were all in the corridors, but no, they were not called. So you had a process which was undemocratic, and you had an accord which was hatched basically to pacify the United States. And what did the accord basically say? It said a couple of things, but the main thing that I wanted to point out is it's really about unraveling the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change and killing the Kyoto Protocol. Why? It does this way. What it does is that it says that the developed countries will undertake voluntary pledges, and they will decide their mitigation targets by pledging. They will pledge what they would like to do together, and then that would be defined as the mitigation targets of the developed countries. But if you looked at how the Kyoto Protocol began, and subsequently, and now we are negotiating the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the understanding was very clear. And with all the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all the assessments that were done, if you recall, suddenly before Copenhagen, in fact after Bali, you found there was a whole euphoria, which was actually good, in a sense that suddenly the world was beginning to understand that climate change was indeed a problem, including the developing countries. And what you began to see was actually that there's recognition that you have to do deep emission cuts, with the developed countries taking the lead, and the target has to be determined by a top-down, scientific, equitably based approach. That means the target is set as defined by science and equity. And then the developed countries share within that target. But what the United States was really attempting to do was to unravel it the other way. They said, we will do a pledge, and we will be gentlemen. We will pledge as we think necessary, and that will be fine for the world. But that's not fine for the world. It was totally anti-environment. It was anti the poor. And it is precisely this that really gave rise to climate injustice, because they did not own up to the historical emissions that they were responsible for. And this is why in Cochabamba, for many of us, I was not there, the volcanic ash prevented me from getting there. As I just told a colleague of mine, Pachamama, Mother Earth did not want me there for some reason or other. But what it really showed for us in Cochabamba was that suddenly the movements around, and lots of people came, 35,000 people came together, social movements and all kinds of civil society, including governments. And for the first time, you actually had a feeling that there is hope, because people were beginning to see that what you really need is real systemic response to the climate crisis, that this is a problem that is caused by the overconsumption of the atmospheric space, the unfair use of the atmospheric space, and that if the developing world is to have a chance, the developed world must ensure that it meets its obligations with massive deep cuts in emissions. And if you look at what the European Union has on the table, I mean, I talked about the US, the European Union is not far behind. Where were they in Copenhagen? They were supposed to be the environmental champions, but they got stuck where they let the United States take the lead. And unfortunately, even now, the EU talks about operationalizing the Copenhagen Accord. So you're basically a champion of the environment or the defender of the Kyoto Protocol, until recently did not even want to say that it was committing to a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And this was really, really frustrating, because now the European Union says, yes, we are willing to have the second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol only if you have the emissions cuts also being taken by developing countries. Also, if there is much more obligations by developed countries on transparency, on what they would do, what they call international consultation and analysis. I mean, if you want to go into the details of it, it's really scary, because they talk about how the mitigation actions of developing countries must be transparent, and therefore they should be able to review it, although there was never in the Bali Agreement. It was only in the Copenhagen Accord. But they seem to be talking the same line as the United States. The only difference is the EU says that there has to be a target. And the target that they talk about really falls short from what is really needed. The EU talks about a 50% cut by 2050 world over, and that the developed countries will do 80% reductions. Now, if you take that, what it actually shows is that the historical debt that they owe would continue, because the world would have forgiven the developed countries their historical emissions, because they would continue to occupy unfairly the atmospheric space. So the carbon budget approach, this is something that Bolivia has advocated very strongly in the negotiations. And since June and in Tianjin, in the negotiations, you have Ambassador Pablo Solon, thank God for him, who has articulated this issue about how do you fairly share the remaining carbon budget that is available, taking into account a historical perspective from 1850 onwards, and how do you allocate it in a way that is fair, taking into account population and the historical emissions debt. Very, very fundamental. And for civil society, those of us from Cochabamba and onwards, this is a very progressive way forward. And this is really about negotiating the future of the way in which we use resources. Now, I can go on, and I know that my time is coming up, and I've got other things I would like to say, but very quickly, this is a centerpiece. The mitigation issue is the centerpiece of Cancun and of South Africa. If the developed countries do not do the meaningful targets and the second commitment period that they have to do, and if we go the Copenhagen Accord way and we allow the US to hijack the process, we have to have this climate referendum. I mean, it is bad. The world, we will have to give up what is fair, and this is really totally unjust. And very quickly on the issue of finance, what the world is looking for is a deal in Cancun on finance. Mm-hmm. There is emerging consensus that there will be a climate fund. The debate about the climate fund is really about where it will be located. The developing countries are saying that the climate fund should be under the UNFCCC, and that the trustee should be found through an open bidding process. The Europeans, and this is the latest communication that I saw from Europe, they're saying that it has to be the World Bank. And the United States is also saying that it has to be the World Bank. So this is the fight that is happening at the moment. And for many of us, from the civil society and social movements, you'll never trust the bank, because the bank got us into a lot of trouble. Why would you then allow the bank to continue to do this? So the bank does not have a proper record. So this is one big debate. And intellectual property rights, as the ambassador talked about. in the technology transfer. For the US, for Japan, this is non-negotiable. They say that intellectual property rights over climate technologies is sacrosanct, non-negotiable. And that's unbelievable. If the climate is in crisis, if technologies have to be diffused, and if the developed world is sincere about what it has to do, then you relax intellectual property. What is private property? When public chaos is and the poor and the world and planet is in distress. So this is really unacceptable. And so I can go on, but I won't. And I hope we'll have many more questions to intervene. But basically, there are progressive voices in the government of Bolivia who are opposing the markets, who do not want the carbon market route, who are fighting for the alternative, who are fighting for what is just. And those of us in civil society have to step up and ensure that Bolivia is not isolated, and other countries around Bolivia, particularly the ALBA governments, are not isolated. And we can win it if we really rally around with thousands of people on the streets, because this is about life and death. Thank you.